October 14th, 2023. The Great Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee. Marcus Thompson and three friends had been hiking an unmarked trail deep in the Appalachian wilderness, exploring terrain that appeared untouched by human presence for decades. The dense forest canopy created permanent twilight even at midday, and the thick undergrowth made every step a challenge. They'd been searching for remnants of old logging roads from the 1930s and 40s, fascinated by how quickly the forest could reclaim what humans had temporarily carved from it. Marcus, a retired history teacher with a passion for local heritage, had been using historical maps to identify routes that no longer appeared on modern surveys. Around 2 p.m., while pushing through particularly dense vegetation in a steep ravine, Marcus's hiking pole struck something solid and metallic beneath the leaves and vines. The sound was unmistakable. Steel, not stone. He called his friends over. "There's something here," he said, pulling aside thick curtains of kudzu and Virginia creeper that had grown into an impenetrable wall of green. Something man-made. Working together, they carefully cleared away decades of accumulated vegetation. What emerged from beneath the forest's embrace made them all freeze in shocked silence. It was a vehicle, a Jeep, military style, from an era long past. The olive-drab paint was faded and mottled with rust, but the distinctive shape was unmistakable. A Willys MB, the iconic Jeep used by the United States Army during World War II. The vehicle sat at an angle in the ravine, its front end lower than the rear, as if it had rolled or slid down an embankment and come to rest here. But it was what they saw through the shattered windscreen that made Marcus immediately reach for his phone to call 911. A human skeleton sat behind the steering wheel, perfectly preserved in the position of someone who had been driving. The skeletal hands remained in place on the wheel, finger bones still curved around where the hard rubber grips would have been. The skull was tilted slightly forward, as if the driver had been looking at the road ahead when death had come. Fragments of an olive-drab military uniform clung to the bones. Enough remained to identify it as United States Army issue from the World War II era. Around the neck bones hung a pair of corroded but intact dog tags. The metal darkened with age, but still legible when Marcus carefully brushed away the dirt with a gloved hand. On the passenger seat, partially obscured by fallen leaves that had blown into the vehicle over decades, lay an M1 Garand rifle, the standard-issue weapon for American infantrymen during the Second World War. A military duffel bag in the back seat had rotted and collapsed, its contents scattered and deteriorated beyond recognition. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office responded within an hour, followed by Tennessee State Police and military affairs specialists from the Department of Defense. By evening, forensic anthropologists and military historians had joined what had become a recovery operation rather than a criminal investigation. The dog tags told the essential story. Private Andrew Michael Johnson, serial number 347-82951, blood type O positive, United States Army, born 1923. A cross-reference with military records revealed that Private Johnson had been reported missing on September 30th, 1945, while traveling from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to his home in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. 78 years Andrew Johnson had been sitting in this Jeep, in this ravine, hidden by the forest for 78 years. He'd been 22 years old when he disappeared, a veteran of the European theater who'd survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, only to die on a Tennessee mountain road just days after being discharged from the Army. His family had spent decades not knowing what had happened to him. His mother had died without answers. His fiancée had waited years before accepting he was gone. His younger sister had carried the mystery of his disappearance to her own grave. And all that time, Andrew had been here, less than 30 miles from home, preserved by the Appalachian forest that had grown around him until the Jeep became invisible from above. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on September 12, 1945, involves a young man who'd survived one of history's most brutal wars, a family desperately waiting for his return, and a simple accident on a mountain road that would create a mystery lasting nearly 8 decades. By the end, you'll understand how Andrew Johnson's journey home became his final resting place. The questions facing investigators were both heartbreaking and soluble. What had happened on that September day in 1945? How had the Jeep ended up in this ravine? And why had decades of searching failed to find a vehicle and driver that had been so close to where people had been looking? Andrew Michael Johnson was 22 years old in September 1945, a young man whose life had been defined by war, but who dreamed only of peace and home. He stood 5 foot 11 inches tall, with the lean, muscular build of someone who'd spent years carrying heavy equipment across European battlefields. His hair had been dark brown, his eyes a warm hazel, and he'd had a quick, genuine smile that people who'd known him always remembered. Andrew had been born on March 7, 1923, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a small mountain town that in those days had been barely more than a cluster of homes and businesses surrounded by the ancient Appalachian Mountains. His father, Robert Johnson, had died in a logging accident when Andrew was 8 years old, leaving his mother, Helen, to raise Andrew and his younger sister, Sarah, alone. Helen Johnson had been a strong, determined woman who'd worked as a seamstress and taken in laundry to support her family. The small house on the outskirts of Gatlinburg where they'd lived had been modest but always clean and filled with love. Andrew had been a good student, and even better older brother. He'd protected Sarah from bullies, helped her with homework, and worked odd jobs from age 12 onward to help his mother with expenses. Those who'd known him during his teenage years had described him as responsible beyond his years, serious about obligations, but still capable of laughter and joy. By age 18, Andrew had been working at a lumber mill, saving money with the vague plan of maybe attending college someday or starting his own business of one. But December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything for Andrew and millions of other young Americans. Andrew had enlisted in the United States Army in February 1942, just before his 19th birthday. His mother had wept when he'd told her, but she understood. The country was at war, and young men like Andrew felt it was their duty to serve. Helen had accompanied him to the recruitment office in Knoxville, standing silently as her son had raised his right hand and sworn to defend the United States against all enemies. His training had been at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where he'd learned to be an infantryman, to march with heavy packs, to fire various weapons, to follow orders without hesitation, and to face the possibility of death with courage. Letters home during this period were cheerful and optimistic, filled with complaints about the heat and the drill sergeants, but also with pride at becoming a soldier. October 1943, Andrew had shipped out to England as part of the massive buildup of Allied forces preparing for the invasion of Europe. He'd been assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit that had been federalized and expanded with recruits from across the country. The months in England were filled with endless training, preparing for an invasion that everyone knew was coming, but whose timing remained a closely guarded secret. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Andrew was among the first wave of soldiers landing on Omaha Beach, one of the bloodiest sectors of the invasion. He'd later tell his family that he didn't remember much of that day, just chaos, noise, death all around him, and somehow making it to the top of the cliffs when so many others hadn't. Of the men who'd landed with his company, fewer than half had survived the first day. Andrew had fought across France through the summer and fall of 1944, participating in the brutal hedgerow combat of Normandy,
the liberation of French towns, and the slow, grinding advance toward Germany. His letters home during this period became shorter and less frequent, and when they came, they focused on small details, the food, the weather, asking about life in Gatlinburg, while avoiding any description of the combat he had experienced. Winter 1944-45 had brought the
Battle of the Vosges, Germany's last major offensive of the war. Andrew's division had been thrown into the desperate fighting to stop the German breakthrough in the Ardennes forest. For weeks, he'd fought in brutal cold, often without adequate food or supplies, holding defensive positions against overwhelming enemy attacks. He'd survived again when so many others hadn't. By spring 1945, the Allied armies had been driving into Germany, and the war's end had been clearly approaching. Andrew's letters home had begun to sound different, hopeful, making plans for his return, talking about the future rather than just surviving the present. He told his mother he wanted to go to college on the GI Bill. He'd told Sarah he'd help pay for her to attend nursing school if she wanted. And he'd told his girlfriend, Mary, that when he got home he wanted to get married right away. Mary Catherine Sullivan had been Andrew's sweetheart since high school. She'd been 17 when Andrew had left for the army, a pretty girl with auburn hair and green eyes who'd promised to wait for him. And she had waited, writing him letters every week for 3 years, sending him photographs, packages of homemade cookies, and constant reassurance that she'd be there when he came home. In his wallet, found in the Jeep 78 years later, Andrew had carried a photograph of Mary taken in the spring of 1942, just before he'd enlisted. On the back, in her neat handwriting, she'd written, "To Andrew, all my love forever, Mary." The war in Europe had ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day. Andrew had been in Germany when the news had come, and according to letters that had reached home in June, he'd been part of the occupation forces, waiting to be sent home for discharge. The army had been demobilizing millions of soldiers, but the process had been slow, and Andrew had chafed at the delay. Finally, in August 1945, Andrew had received orders to report to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for discharge processing. His letters home had been filled with excitement. He'd told his mother he'd probably be home by mid-September. He'd told Sarah to start making wedding plans. He'd told Sarah he'd be there in time for her 17th birthday on September 20th. His last letter home, postmarked August 28, 1945, from Fort Campbell, had said, "Dear Mother, Mary, and Sarah, I'm almost home, finishing up the discharge paperwork this week. Should be in Gatlinburg by September 15th at the latest. Can't wait to see you all. Tell Mary I love her, and we'll set a wedding date as soon as I get there. Tell Sarah I'm bringing her a birthday present from France. I'll see you all very soon. All my love, Andrew." September 12, 1945 would be the day Andrew Johnson began his final journey home. He'd survived 3 years of war, countless battles, and unimaginable dangers. He'd been so close to safety, so close to home, so close to the future he'd dreamed about through all those months in foxholes and on battlefields. But he would never arrive, and his family would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to the young man who'd survived everything the war could throw at him, but had somehow vanished on a peaceful September day in the mountains of Tennessee. Thursday, September 12, 1945, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Andrew Johnson had risen early, filled with the kind of nervous excitement that comes from knowing a long-awaited moment is finally arriving. Today was his last day in the United States Army. By afternoon, he'd be a civilian again, free to go home and start the life he'd put on hold 3.5 years earlier. The discharge process at Fort Campbell had been efficiently organized, but still time-consuming. Hundreds of soldiers were being processed daily, each requiring medical examinations, paperwork verification, final pay calculations, and issuance of discharge documents.
Andrew had waited in lines, answered questions, signed forms, and gradually worked through the bureaucratic requirements of leaving military service. Around noon, he'd received his discharge papers, the official DD-214 that declared him honorably discharged from active duty as of September 12, 1945. He'd also received his final pay, several $100s in cash, that represented accumulated salary and discharge bonus, and he'd been allowed to keep his uniform and certain personal equipment, though his rifle and ammunition had been turned into the armory. Andrew had made arrangements to get home during the morning's processing. The Army was providing transportation to major cities for discharged soldiers, but Gatlinburg wasn't a major city. It was a small mountain town that required traveling through the Smoky Mountains on roads that ranged from adequate to barely passable. Several people had seen Andrew during the early part of his journey. A gas station attendant in Clarksville, Tennessee, remembered filling the Jeep's tank around 3:30 p.m. and chatting briefly with a young soldier heading home after discharge. A waitress at a diner in Springfield had served Andrew coffee and pie around 5 p.m., noting that he seemed happy and excited.
Talking about getting home to see his fiancée. After Springfield, the sightings had ended. Andrew's route would have taken him into increasingly remote mountain country as he approached the Smoky Mountains. By the time darkness fell, around 7:30 p.m., Andrew would have been driving mountain roads with minimal lighting and no modern safety features like guardrails or reflective markers. The exact route Andrew had taken after leaving Springfield remained uncertain. There were several possible ways to reach Gatlinburg from that direction, some more direct but more difficult, others longer but on better roads. In the absence of modern highways, drivers often made route decisions based on local knowledge, weather conditions, and personal preference. What investigators would later determine was that Andrew had taken a route through the mountains on roads that were little more than improved logging tracks, perhaps trying to save time, perhaps following directions that had seemed reasonable, perhaps simply making the kind of navigation error that was common in an era before GPS or even reliable road signs. Somewhere on those mountain roads, in the darkness of that September night, Andrew Johnson's journey had ended. Friday, September 13, 1945. Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Helen Johnson had risen early, as she always did, to prepare breakfast and get Sarah ready for school. But this morning had been different, filled with anticipation and nervous energy. Andrew's letter saying he'd be home by mid-September meant he could arrive any day, and Helen had been watching the road constantly, hoping to see her son walking up the path to their small house. Sarah had been even more excited, barely able to concentrate on her schoolwork. Her 17th birthday was coming up on September 20th, and the thought of having Andrew home to celebrate it had made the wait almost unbearable. She'd told all her friends that her brother was coming home from the war, a hero who'd survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. Mary Sullivan had visited the Johnson house that morning, as she'd day, but certainly not 4 days, even allowing for breakdowns, bad weather, or other delays. Andrew should have arrived by now. Helen had called Fort Campbell on Monday morning, using the one phone in Gatlinburg's general store. After being transferred multiple times and waiting for over an hour, she'd finally reached someone who could check Andrew's discharge records. "Ma'am, Private Johnson was discharged on September 12th as scheduled," the clerk had told her. "He left the base that afternoon. We don't have any information about his travel after that." "But he never arrived home," Helen had explained, her voice shaking. "He wrote that he was coming straight here. Where is my son?" The clerk had promised to look into it and call back. That call had come 3 days later on September 20th. Sarah's 17th birthday, which should have been a celebration with Andrew home, but instead had become a day of growing dread. "Mrs. Johnson, I've spoken with Private First Class Thomas Miller, who was the last person to see your son at Fort Campbell," the Army representative had said.
According to Miller, he loaned Andrew a military Jeep to drive home. The Jeep hasn't been returned to the depot as expected. Both Private Johnson and the vehicle are missing. The investigation that had followed had been hampered by the chaos of post-war demobilization and the limitations of 1945 technology and communication. The Army had been processing thousands of discharges daily and dealing with enormous logistical challenges. One missing soldier and one missing Jeep, while concerning, had not been a high priority. Local law enforcement in Gatlinburg and surrounding counties had been notified. Sheriff's deputies had driven the most likely routes between Fort Campbell and Gatlinburg, looking for any sign of Andrew or the Jeep. They'd checked with gas stations, diners where Andrew might have stopped. Several people remembered seeing a young soldier in an Army Jeep, but the sightings had ended somewhere east of Springfield. The search had been complicated by the terrain. The route from Springfield to Gatlinburg crossed some of the most rugged country in Tennessee, with countless small roads, logging tracks, and remote areas where a vehicle could go off the road and not be visible from the traveled path. In 1945, there had been no helicopters to conduct aerial searches, no sophisticated rescue equipment, just men on foot and in vehicles trying to cover hundreds of square miles of mountain wilderness. Helen Johnson had spent her life savings hiring private searchers, posting rewards, doing everything a desperate mother could do to find her missing son. Mary Sullivan had joined every search party, walking mountain roads and calling Andrew's name until her voice gave out. Sarah had written to everyone she could think of, the Army, the FBI, newspapers, congressmen, begging for help finding her brother. The searches had continued sporadically for months, then years. Every spring, when the snow melted and the mountains became passable again, new searches would be organized. Every time someone reported seeing an abandoned vehicle or finding something that might be related to Andrew, investigators had followed up. But in 1945 Tennessee, there had been limitations that made finding a vehicle in the vast Appalachian wilderness extraordinarily difficult. The mountains held countless ravines, hollows, and remote areas where a vehicle could go off the road and not be visible from the traveled path. In 1945, there had been no helicopters to conduct aerial searches, no sophisticated rescue equipment, just men on foot and in vehicles trying to cover hundreds of square miles of mountain wilderness. Helen Johnson had spent her life savings hiring private searchers, posting rewards, doing everything a desperate mother could do to find her missing son. Mary Sullivan had joined every search party, walking mountain roads and calling Andrew's name until her voice gave out. Sarah had written to everyone she could think of, the Army, the FBI, newspapers, congressmen, begging for help finding her brother. The searches had continued sporadically for months, then years. Every spring, when the snow melted and the mountains became passable again, new searches would be organized. Every time someone reported seeing an abandoned vehicle or finding something that might be related to Andrew, investigators had followed up. But in 1945 Tennessee, there had been limitations that made finding a vehicle in the vast Appalachian wilderness extraordinarily difficult. The mountains held countless ravines, hollows, and remote areas where a vehicle could go off the road and not be visible from the traveled path. In 1945, there had been no helicopters to conduct aerial searches, no sophisticated rescue equipment, just men on foot and in vehicles trying to cover hundreds of square miles of mountain wilderness.
Maintained or traveled had gradually been reclaimed by the forest. The specific section of road where Andrew's Jeep had left the pavement and plunged into the ravine had been particularly remote even in 1945. By the 1960s, it had been completely overgrown, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The forest had done what forests do. It had grown, spread, covered, and absorbed everything man made until the area looked as it had before humans had ever carved roads through it. The Jeep itself had become part of the landscape. The olive drab paint had faded and been covered by rust. Vines had grown over and around it. Leaves had accumulated inside and out. Small animals had made homes in the engine compartment and under the seats. Trees had grown up around it, their roots gradually embracing the metal frame. Within a decade of the accident, the Jeep would have been difficult to see even from a few feet away. Within 2 decades, it had been essentially invisible. Andrew's family had never given up searching, though the nature of that search had changed over the years. In the immediate aftermath of his disappearance, the search had been physical. People walking mountain roads, searching ravines, checking abandoned buildings. As years passed without success, the search had become more about keeping his memory alive and maintaining hope that someday, somehow, answers would come. Helen Johnson had contacted every psychic, medium, and clairvoyant she'd heard about, desperate for any information about her son's fate. Some had claimed to see visions of Andrew alive in distant places. Others had described accidents or violence that had supposedly claimed his life. None had provided information that led anywhere useful, but Helen had followed every lead with the desperation of a mother who couldn't accept her child was gone without proof. The Johnson family had maintained connections with other families of missing servicemen, forming a community of people united by loss and unanswered questions. They'd attended annual memorials for the missing, written letters to congressional representatives demanding more resources for search efforts, and supported each other through the unique grief that comes from not knowing. Sarah Johnson had made it her personal mission to document every detail of Andrew's disappearance and the searches that had followed. She'd maintained files of correspondence with the Army, police reports, newspaper clippings, and her own detailed notes about every search effort and every reported sighting. By the time of her death in 2019, she'd accumulated dozens of boxes of documents related to her brother's case. Sarah's children and grandchildren had grown up hearing stories about Uncle Andrew, the war hero who disappeared on his way home. To them, Andrew had been almost mythical, a figure from family history who'd existed more in stories than reality. They'd learned about his service in World War II, seen his medals and commendations, read his letters home, but they'd never known him as a real person, only as an absence that had shaped their grandmother's life. When Sarah had died in 2019, her granddaughter, Jennifer, had inherited the boxes of documents about Andrew's case. Jennifer, a lawyer with an interest in historical mysteries, had been fascinated by the story and had considered trying to mount a new search using modern technology. But by 2019, 74 years had passed since Andrew's disappearance. Anyone who might have had direct knowledge was long dead. The trails had gone cold decades earlier. Jennifer had scanned all of Sarah's documents and created a digital archive, uploading it to a website dedicated to missing World War II veterans. The site had attracted some attention from historians and genealogists, but had generated no new leads about Andrew's fate. The area of the Smoky Mountains where Andrew's Jeep had ultimately been discovered had seen minimal human presence for decades. The old logging roads that had brought people to the area in the 1930s and 40s had been abandoned. Modern highways had diverted traffic away from the remote hollows and ridges. The creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had protected vast areas from development, allowing the forest to return to something approaching its pre-settlement condition. Occasionally, hikers ventured into the more remote areas, but most stayed on established trails. The ravine where Andrew's Jeep had come to rest was in an area that wasn't on any trail maps, in terrain that was difficult enough to discourage casual exploration. You had to be specifically looking for unmarked old roads to end up in that area, which was exactly what Marcus Thompson and his friends had been doing when they'd made their discovery. Marcus Thompson had been fascinated by local history since childhood, when his grandfather had told him stories about the lumber industry that had dominated the Smoky Mountains in the early 20th century. As a history teacher, Marcus had turned that childhood interest into a serious hobby, researching old logging operations and trying to locate the roads and infrastructure they'd left behind.
In October 2023, Marcus had obtained copies of 1940s-era Forest Service maps showing old roads that no longer appeared on modern surveys. He'd been particularly interested in a network of roads that had been built to access logging operations in what is now the national park. Using historical maps and modern GPS, Marcus and 3 friends had been trying to trace the old routes and document what remained. The area they'd been exploring on October 14th had been particularly challenging: steep terrain covered in dense vegetation with no obvious signs of the road that should have existed based on their maps. They'd been following a ravine that the historical maps had shown as parallel to one of the old roads, thinking they might find evidence of the route along the ridge line above. When Marcus's hiking pole had struck the Jeep's metal frame, his first thought was that they'd found remnants of old logging equipment. The forest was full of abandoned machinery from the lumber industry, old cables, metal parts, even entire pieces of equipment that had been left behind when operations had shut down. But as they'd cleared away the vegetation, the distinctive shape had become obvious. This wasn't logging equipment, it was a vehicle, and from its style, clearly a very old one. The moment Marcus had seen the military olive-drab paint beneath the rust, he'd known they'd found something historically significant. The discovery of the skeleton had transformed what might have been an interesting historical find into something far serious. Marcus immediately called 911, carefully noting the GPS coordinates and making sure no one touched anything that might be evidence. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office had responded first, followed by Tennessee State Police. When the first officers had arrived and seen the Jeep and its occupant, they'd immediately recognized the historical significance and called for additional resources. By late afternoon, representatives from the Department of Defense, historical militaries, and forensic anthropologists had joined what had become a carefully coordinated recovery operation. The scene had been photographed extensively before anyone attempted to disturb anything. The Jeep's position in the ravine, the surrounding terrain, the vegetation growth patterns, all had been documented to help reconstruct what happened 78 years earlier. The Jeep itself had been remarkably preserved, despite nearly 80 years of exposure to the elements. The Appalachian climate, with cold winters and humid summers, had caused significant rust and deterioration, but the basic structure had remained intact. The engine, though seized and corroded, was still recognizable. The tires had rotted away to nothing, leaving only the metal wheels. The seats had deteriorated to their metal frames, but fragments of the original fabric and padding remained. Small animals had made homes in the engine compartment and under the seats. Trees had grown up around it, their roots gradually embracing the metal frame. Within a decade of the accident, the Jeep would have been difficult to see even from a few feet away. Within 2 decades, it had been essentially invisible. Andrew's family had never given up searching, though the nature of that search had changed over the years. In the immediate aftermath of his disappearance, the search had been physical. People walking mountain roads, searching ravines, checking abandoned buildings. As years passed without success, the search had become more about keeping his memory alive and maintaining hope that someday, somehow, answers would come. Helen Johnson had contacted every psychic, medium, and clairvoyant she'd heard about, desperate for any information about her son's fate. Some had claimed to see visions of Andrew alive in distant places. Others had described accidents or violence that had supposedly claimed his life. None had provided information that led anywhere useful, but Helen had followed every lead with the desperation of a mother who couldn't accept her child was gone without proof. The Johnson family had maintained connections with other families of missing servicemen, forming a community of people united by loss and unanswered questions. They'd attended annual memorials for the missing, written letters to congressional representatives demanding more resources for search efforts, and supported each other through the unique grief that comes from not knowing. Sarah Johnson had made it her personal mission to document every detail of Andrew's disappearance and the searches that had followed. She'd maintained files of correspondence with the Army, police reports, newspaper clippings, and her own detailed notes about every search effort and every reported sighting. By the time of her death in 2019, she'd accumulated dozens of boxes of documents related to her brother's case. Sarah's children and grandchildren had grown up hearing stories about Uncle Andrew, the war hero who disappeared on his way home. To them, Andrew had been almost mythical.
World War II. The dog tags around the neck bones had been the key to identification. Johnson Andrew M., followed by his serial number, blood type, and religious preference. The M1 Garand rifle on the passenger seat had been severely rusted but still identifiable. Forensic examination would show it had been unloaded. The clip had been removed and was found in the glove compartment, indicating Andrew had been following proper safety procedures for transporting the weapon. In the glove compartment, protected somewhat from the elements by the Jeep's dashboard, investigators had found Andrew's discharge papers. The documents had been severely deteriorated but still partially legible, showing his discharge date of September 12, 1945, and his home address in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Most poignantly, in what remained of Andrew's uniform pocket, investigators had found his wallet. The leather had deteriorated badly, but inside, protected by the wallet's layers, had been several items that had survived remarkably well. A photograph of a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes, several coins, and what appeared to be a well-worn letter. The photograph had been identified as Mary Sullivan, Andrew's fiancée, from a picture taken in 1942. On the back, her handwriting was still faintly visible. "To Andrew, all my love forever, Mary." The letter had been from Andrew's mother, written in July 1945, and apparently carried with him constantly. Parts of it were still legible. "We're so proud of you. Can't wait to have you home. Mary asks about you every day. Love, Mother." The recovery of Andrew's remains had taken 2 days of careful work. Forensic anthropologists had documented every detail of the skeleton's position before beginning the delicate process of removing the bones from the Jeep. Each bone had been photographed in situ, then carefully extracted and labeled for later examination. The Jeep itself had been too deteriorated and overgrown to be removed intact. After all evidence had been collected, it had been documented one final time and left in place where it would gradually complete its transformation from vehicle to part of the forest. The identification of the remains as Private Andrew Johnson had been confirmed through multiple methods. The dog tags had provided the initial identification. Dental records, miraculously still available in Army archives from Andrew's enlistment physical in 1942, had provided definitive confirmation, and DNA comparison with samples provided by Sarah Johnson's descendants had verified familial relationship consistent with siblings. After 78 years, the mystery of what had happened to Andrew Johnson had been solved. The young soldier who'd survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, who'd been coming home to marry his sweetheart and help his family, had died in a simple traffic accident less than 30 miles from his destination. A moment of inattention, a curve taken too fast, perhaps fatigue after a long day of driving, and a life full of promise had ended in a ravine that would hide his final resting place for nearly 8 decades. The forensic analysis of the accident scene and Andrew's remains provided a clear picture of what had happened on that September night in 1945. The evidence told a story of exhaustion,